Chapter 2 of the Afghan Wars, 1839 to 1842 and 1878 to 1880. Part 1. The First Afghan War, by Archibald Forbes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 2. The March to Cabul. The two main objectives of the venturesome offensive movement to which Lord Auckland had committed himself were first the raising of the Persian siege of Herat, if the place should hold out until reached, the recapture of it if it should have fallen, and secondly the establishment of Shah Soojah on the Afghan throne. The former object was the more pressing, and time was very precious, but the distances in India are great, the means of communication in 1838 did not admit celerity, and the seasons controlled the safe prosecution of military operations. Nevertheless, the concentration of the army at the frontier station of Ferozepur was fully accomplished toward the end of November. Sir Harry Fane was to be the military head of the expedition, and he had just right to be proud of the 14,000 carefully selected and well seasoned troops who constituted his Bengal contingent. The force consisted of two infantry divisions, of which the first, commanded by Major General Sir Willoughby Cotton, contained 3 brigades, commanded respectively by Colonels Sale, Nott and Dennis, of whom the two former were to attain high distinction within the borders of Afghanistan. Major General Duncan commanded the 2nd Infantry Division of the 2 brigades, of which one was commanded by Colonel Roberts, the gallant father of a gallant son, the other by Colonel Worsley. The 6,000 troops raised for Shah Soojah, who were under Fane's orders and were officered from our army in India, had been recently and hurriedly recruited, and although rapidly improving, were not yet in a state of high efficiency. The contingent which the Bombay Presidency was to furnish to the Army of the Indus, and which landed about the close of the year near the mouth of the Indus, was under the command of General Sir John Keane, the Commander-in-Chief of the Bombay Army. The Bombay force was about 5,000 strong. Before the concentration at Ferozepur had been completed, Lord Auckland received official intimation of the retreat of the Persians from before Herat. With their departure had gone also the sole legitimate object of the expedition. There remained but a project of wanton aggression and usurpation. The Russo-Persian failure at Herat was scarcely calculated to maintain in the astute and practical Afghans any hope of fulfilment of the promises which the Western powers had thrown about so lavishly, while it made clear that, for some time at least to come, the Persians would not be found dancing again to Russian fiddling. The abandonment of the siege of Herat rendered the invasion of Afghanistan an aggression destitute even of pretext. The Governor-General endeavoured to justify his resolution to persevere in it by putting forth the argument that its prosecution was required, alike in observation of the treaties entered into with Runjeet Singh and Shah Soojah, as by paramount considerations of defensive policy. A remarkable illustration of defensive policy, to take the offensive against a remote country from whose further confines had faded away foiled aggression, leaving behind nothing but a bitter consciousness of broken promises. As for the other plea, the tripartite treaty contained no covenant that we should send a corporal's guard across our frontier. If Shah Soojah had a powerful following in Afghanistan, he could regain his throne without our assistance. If he had no holding there, it was for us a truly discreditable enterprise to foist him on a recalcitrant people at the point of the bayonet. One result of the tidings from Herat was to reduce by a division the strength of the expeditionary force. Fane, who had never taken kindly to the project, declined to associate himself with the diminished array that remained. The command of the Bengal column fell to Sir Willoughby Cotton, with whom, as his aide-de-camp, rode that Henry Havelock whose name 20 years later was to ring through India and England. Duncan's division was to stand fast at Ferozepur as a support, by which disposition the strength of the Bengal marching force was cut down to about 9,500 fighting men. After its junction with the Bombay column, the army would be 14,500 strong, without reckoning the Shah's contingent. There was an interlude at Ferozepur of reviews and high jinks with the shrewd, debauched old Runjeet Singh, of which proceedings Havelock, in his narrative of the expedition, gives a detailed account, dwelling with extreme disapprobation on Runjeet's addiction to a 'pet tipple,' strong enough to lay out the hardest drinker in the British camp, but which the old reprobate quaffed freely without turning a hair. At length, on December 10th, 1838, Cotton began the long march which was not to terminate at Cabul until August 6th of the following year. The most direct route was across the Punjaub and up the passes from Peshawar, but the Governor General had shrunk from proposing to Runjeet Singh that the force should march through his territories, thinking it enough that the Maharaja had permitted Shah Soojah's heir, Prince Timour, to go by Peshawar to Cabul, had engaged to support him with a Sikh force, and had agreed to maintain an army of reserve at Peshawar. The chosen route was by the left bank of the Sutlej to its junction with the Indus, down the left bank of the Indus to the crossing point at Rori, and from Sukkur across the Sindhi and northern Belukh provinces, by the Bolan and Kojuk passes to Kandahar, thence by Khelat-i-Ghilzai and Gunzi to Cabul. This was a line excessively circuitous, immensely long, full of difficulties, and equally disadvantageous as to supplies and communications. On the way the column would have to effect a junction with the Bombay force, which at Vikur was distant 800 miles from Ferozepur. Of the distance of 850 miles from the latter post to Kandahar, the first half, to the crossing of the Indus, presented no serious difficulties, but from Sukkur beyond the country was inhospitable and cruelly rugged. It needed little military knowledge to realise how more and yet more precarious would become the communications as the chain lengthened, to discern that from Ferozepur to the Indus they would be at the mercy of the Sikhs, and to comprehend this also, that a single serious check in or beyond the passes would involve all but inevitable ruin. Shah Soojah and his levies moved independently some marches in advance of Cotton. The Durrani monarch-elect had already crossed the Indus, and was encamped at Shikarpur, when he was joined by Mr William Hay Macnaghten of the Company's Civil Service, the high functionary who had been gazetted as "envoy and minister on the part of the Government of India at the court of Shah Soojah ul Mulk." Durand pronounces the selection an unhappy one. "For Macnaghten, long accustomed to irresponsible office, inexperienced in men, and ignorant of the country and people of Afghanistan, was, though an erudite Arabic scholar, neither practised in the field of Asiatic intrigue nor a man of action. His ambition was, however, great, and the expedition, holding out the promise of distinction and honours, had met with his strenuous advocacy." Macnaghten was one of the three men who chiefly inspired Lord Auckland with the policy to which he had committed himself. He was the negotiator of the tripartite treaty. He was now on his way toward a region wherein he was to concern himself in strange adventures, the outcome of which was to darken his reputation, consign him to a sudden cruel death, bring awful ruin on the enterprise he had fostered, and inflict incalculable damage on British prestige in India. Marching through Bawalpur and northern Scinde, without noteworthy incident, save heavy losses of draught cattle, Cotton's army reached Rori, the point at which the Indus was to be crossed, in the third week of January 1839. Here a delay was encountered. The Scinde Amirs were, with reason, angered by the unjust and exacting terms which Pottinger had been instructed to enforce on them. They had been virtually independent of Afghanistan for nearly half a century. There was now masterfully demanded of them £250,000 sterling in name of back tribute, and this in the face of the fact that they held a solemn release by Shah Soojah of all past and future claims. When they demurred to this and to other exactions, they were peremptorily told that, quote, neither the ready power to crush and annihilate them, nor the will to call it into action, was wanting if it appeared requisite, however remotely, for the safety and integrity of the Anglo-Indian Empire and frontier." Unquote. It was little wonder that the Amirs were reluctant to fall in with terms advanced so arrogantly. Keane marched up the right bank of the Indus to within a couple of marches of Hyderabad, and having heard of the rejection by the Emirs of Pottinger's terms, and of the gathering of some 20,000 armed Beluchis about the capital, he called for the cooperation of part of the Bengal column in a move on Hyderabad. Cotton started on his march down the left bank on January 30th with 5,600 men. Under menaces so ominous, the unfortunate Amirs succumbed. Cotton returned to Rori. The Bengal column crossed the Indus, and on February 20th its headquarters reached Shikarpur. 10 days later, Cotton leading the advance was in Dadur at the foot of the Bolan Pass, having suffered heavily in transport animals almost from the start. Supplies were scarce in a region so barren, but with a month's partial food on his beast of burden, he quitted Dadur March 10th, got safely, if toilsomely, through the Bolan, and on 26th reached Quetta, where he was to halt for orders. Shah Soojah and Keane followed, their troops suffering not a little from scarcity of supplies and loss of animals. Keane's error in detaining Cotton at Quetta until he should arrive proved itself in the semi-starvation to which the troops of the Bengal column were reduced. The Khan of Khelat, whether from disaffection or inability, left unfulfilled his promise to supply grain, and the result of the quarrel which Burnes picked with him was that he shunned coming in and paying homage to Shah Soojah, for which default he was to suffer cruel and unjustifiable ruin. The sepoys were put on half, the camp followers on quarter rations, and the force for 11 days had been idly consuming the waning supplies, when at length on April 6th Keane came into camp, having already formally assumed the command of the whole army, and made certain alterations in its organisation and subsidiary commands. There still remained to be traversed 147 miles before Kandahar should be reached, and the dreaded Kojuk Pass had still to be penetrated. Keane was a soldier who had gained a reputation for courage in Egypt and the Peninsula. He was indebted to the acuteness of his engineer and the valour of his troops for the peerage conferred on him for Ghuznee, and it cannot be said that during his command in Afghanistan he disclosed any marked military aptitude. But he had sufficient perception to recognise that he had brought the Bengal column to the verge of starvation in Quetta, and sufficient common sense to discern that, since if it remained there it would soon starve outright, the best thing to be done was to push it forward with all possible speed onto a region where food should be procurable. Acting on this reasoning, he marched the day after his arrival. Cotton, while lying in Quetta, had not taken the trouble to reconnoitre the passes in advance, far less to make a practicable road through the Kojuk defile, if that should prove the best route. The resolution was taken to march through it. 2 days were spent in making the pass possible for wheels, and from the 13th to the 21st the column was engaged in overcoming the obstacles it presented, losing in the task, besides, much baggage, supplies, transport and ordnance stores. Further back in the Bolan, Wiltshire with the Bombay column was faring worse. He was plundered severely by tribal marauders. By May 4th the main body of the army was encamped in the plain of Kandahar. From the Kojuk, Shah Soojah and his contingent had led the advance towards the southern capital of the dominions, from the throne of which he had been cast down 30 years before. The Kandahar chiefs had meditated a night attack on his raw troops, but Macnaghten's intrigues and bribes had wrought defection in their camp; and while Kohundur Khan and his brothers were in flight to Girishk on the Helmund, the infamous Haji Khan Kakur led the venal herd of turncoat sycophants to the feet of the claimant who came backed by the British gold, which Macnaghten was scattering abroad with lavish hand. Shah Soojah recovered from his trepidation, hurried forward in advance of his troops, and entered Kandahar on April 24th. His reception was cold. The influential chiefs stood aloof, abiding the signs of the times. The populace of Kandahar stood silent and lowering. Nor did the sullenness abate when the presence of a large army with its followers promptly raised the price of grain, to the great distress of the poor. The ceremony of the solemn recognition of the Shah, held close to the scene of his defeat in 1834, Havelock describes as an imposing pageant, with homagings and royal salutes, parades of troops, and presentation of nuzzurs; but the arena set apart for the inhabitants was empty, spite of Eastern love for a tamasha, and the display of enthusiasm was confined to the immediate retainers of His Majesty. The Shah was eager for the pursuit of the fugitive chiefs, but the troops were jaded and sickly, the cavalry were partially dismounted, and what horses remained were feeble skeletons. The transport animals needed grazing and rest, and their loss of numbers to be made good. The crops were not yet ripe, and provisions were scant and dear. When on May the 9th Sale marched towards Girishk, his detachment carried half rations, and his handful of regular cavalry was all that 2 regiments could furnish. Reaching Girishk, he found that the chiefs had fled towards Sistan, and leaving a regiment of the Shah's contingent in occupation, he returned to Kandahar. Macnaghten professed the belief, and perhaps may have deluded himself into it, that Kandahar had received the Shah with enthusiasm. He was sanguine that the march to Cabul would be unopposed, and he urged on Keane, who was wholly dependent on the envoy for political information, to move forward at once, lightening the difficulties of the march by leaving the Bombay troops at Kandahar. But Keane declined, on the advice of Thompson, his chief engineer, who asked significantly whether he had found the information given him by the political department in any single instance correct. Food prospects, however, did not improve at Kandahar, and leaving a strong garrison there as well, curious to say, as the siege train, which with arduous labour had been brought up the passes, Keane began the march to Cabul on June 27th. He had supplies only sufficient to carry his army thither on half rations. Macnaghten had lavished money so freely that the treasury chest was all but empty. How the Afghans regarded the invasion was evinced by condign slaughter of our stragglers. As the army advanced up the valley of the Turnuk, the climate became more temperate, the harvest was later, and the troops improved in health and spirit. Concentrating his forces, Keane reached Ghuznee on July 21st. The reconnaissance he had made proved that fortress occupied in force. The outpost driven in and a close inspection made, the works were found stronger than had been represented, and its regular reduction was out of the question without the battering train which Keane had allowed himself to be persuaded into leaving behind. A wall some 70 feet high, and a wet ditch in front, made mining and escalade alike impracticable. Thompson, however, noticed that the road and bridge to the Cabul gate were intact. He obtained trustworthy information that up to a recent date, while all the other gates had been built up, the Cabul gate had not been so dealt with. As he watched, a horseman was seen to enter by it. This was conclusive. The ground within 400 yards of the gate offered good artillery positions. Thomson therefore reported that although the operation was full of risk, and success if attained must cost dear, yet in the absence of a less hazardous method of reduction, there offered a fair chance of success in an attempt to blow open the Cabul gate and then carry the place by a coup de main. Keane was precluded from the alternative of masking the place and continuing his advance by the all but total exhaustion of his supplies, which the capture of Ghuznee would replenish, and he therefore resolved on an assault by the Cabul gate. During the 21st July the army circled round the place and camped to the north of it on the Cabul road. The following day was spent in preparations and in defeating an attack made on the Shah's contingent by several thousand Ghilzai tribesmen of the adjacent hill country. In the gusty darkness of the early morning of the 23rd, the field artillery was placed in battery on the heights opposite the northern face of the fortress. The 13th Regiment was extended in skirmishing order in the gardens under the wall of this face, and a detachment of sepoys was detailed to make a false attack on the eastern face. Near the centre of the northern face was the Cabul gate, in front of which lay waiting for the signal a storming party consisting of the light companies of the 4 European regiments under command of Colonel Denny of the 13th. The main column consisted of 2 European regiments and the support of a third, the whole commanded by Brigadier Sale. The native regiments constituted the reserve. All those dispositions were completed by 3 a.m, and favoured by the noise of the wind and the darkness without alarming the garrison. Punctually at this hour the little party of engineers charged with the task of blowing in the gate started forward on the hazardous errand. Captain Peat of the Bombay Engineers was in command. Durand, a young lieutenant of Bengal Engineers, who was later to attain high distinction, was entrusted with the service of heading the explosion party. The latter, leading the party, had advanced unmolested to within 150 yards of the works, when a challenge, a shot, and a shout gave intimation of his detection. A musketry fire was promptly opened by the garrison from the battlements, and blue lights illuminated the approach to the gate. But in the fortunate absence of fire from the lower works the bridge was safely crossed, and Peat, with his handful of linesmen, halted in the sallyport to cover the explosion operation. Durand advanced to the gate, his sappers piled their powder bags against it and withdrew. Durand and his sergeant uncoiled the hose, ignited the quick match under a rain from the battlements of bullets and miscellaneous missiles, and then retired to cover out of reach of the explosion. At the sound of the first shot from the battlements, Keane's cannon had opened their fire. The skirmishers in the gardens engaged in a brisk fusillade. The rattle of Hay's musketry was heard from the east. The garrison was alert in its reply. The northern ramparts became a sheet of flame, and everywhere the cannonade and musketry fire waxed in noise and volume. Suddenly, as the day was beginning to dawn, a dull, heavy sound was heard by the head of the waiting column, scarce audible elsewhere because of the boisterous wind and the din of the firing. A pillar of black smoke shot up from where had been the Afghan gate, now shattered by the 300 pounds of gunpowder which Durand had exploded against it. The signal to the storming party was to be the advance sounded by the bugler who accompanied Peat, but the bugler had been shot through the head. Durand could not find Peat. Going back through the bullets to the nearest party of infantry, he experienced some delay, but at last the column was apprised that all was right. The advance was sounded. Denny and his stormers sped forward, and Sale followed at the head of the main column. After a temporary check to the latter because of a misconception, it pushed on in close support of Denny. That gallant soldier and his gallant followers had rushed into the smoking and gloomy archway, to find themselves met hand to hand by the Afghan defenders who had recovered from their surprise. Nothing could be distinctly seen in the narrow gorge, but the clash of sword blade against bayonet was heard on every side. the stormers had to grope their way between the yet standing walls in a dusk which the glimmer of the blue light only made more perplexing. But some elbow room was gradually gained, and then, since there was neither time nor space for methodic street fighting, each loaded section gave its volley and then made way for the next, which, crowding to the front, poured a deadly discharge at half pistol shot into the densely crowded defenders. Thus the storming party won steadily its way, till at length Dennie and his leading files discerned over the heads of their opponents a patch of blue sky and a twinkling star or two, and with a final charge found themselves within the place. A body of fierce Afghan swordsmen projected themselves into the interval between the storming party and the main column. Sale, at the head of the latter, was cut down by a tulwar stroke in the face. In the effort of his blow the assailant fell with the assailed, and they rolled together among the shattered timbers of the gate. Sale, wounded again on the ground, and faint with loss of blood, called to one of his officers for assistance. Kershaw ran the Afghan through the body with his sword, but he still struggled with the brigadier. At length in the grapple Sale got uppermost, and then he dealt his adversary a sabre cut which cleft him from crown to eyebrows. There was much confused fighting within the place, for the Afghan garrison made furious rallies again and again, but the citadel was found open and undefended, and by sunrise British banners were waving above its battlements. Hyder Khan, the governor of Ghuznee, one of the sons of Dost Mahomed, was found concealed in a house in the town and taken prisoner. The British loss amounted to about 200 killed and wounded. That of the garrison, which was estimated at from 3,000 to 4,000 strong, was over 500 killed. The number of wounded was not ascertained. Of prisoners taken in arms there were about 1,600. The booty consisted of numerous horses, camels and mules, ordnance and military weapons of various descriptions, and a vast quantity of supplies of all kinds. Keane, having garrisoned Ghuznee and left there his sick and wounded, resumed on July 30th his march on Cabul. Within 24 hours after the event, Dost Mahomed heard of the fall of Ghuznee. Possessed of the adverse intelligence, the Dost gathered his chiefs, received their facile assurances of fidelity, sent his brother the Nawaub Jubbar Khan to ask what terms Shah Soojah and his British allies were prepared to offer him, and recalled from Jellalabad his son Akbar Khan, with all the force he could muster there. The Dost's emissary to the Allied camp was informed that, quote, an honourable asylum, unquote, in British India was at the service of his brother, an office which Jubbar Khan declined in his name without thanks. Before he left to share the fortunes of the Dost, the Sirdar is reported to have asked Macnaghten, quote, if Shah Soojah is really our king, what need has he of your army and name? You have brought him here,' he continued, 'with your money and arms. Well, leave him now with us Afghans, and let him rule us if he can.' Unquote. When Jubbar Khan returned to Cabul with his sombre message, the Dost, having been joined by Akbar Khan, concentrated his army and found himself at the head of 13,000 men with 30 guns, but he mournfully realised that he could lean no reliance on the constancy and courage of his adherents. Nevertheless he marched out along the Ghuznee road and drew up his force at Ungundeh, where he commanded the most direct line of retreat toward the western hill country of Bamian, in case his people would not fight, or should they fight if they were beaten. There was no fight in his following. Scarcely indeed was there a loyal supporter among all those who had eaten his salt for years. There was true manhood in this chief whom we were replacing by an effete puppet. The Dost, Koran in hand, rode among his perfidious troops and conjured them in the name of God and the Prophet not to dishonour themselves by transferring their allegiance to one who had filled Afghanistan with infidels and blasphemers. Quote, 'If,' he continued, 'you are resolved to be traitors to me, at least enable me to die with honour. Support the brother of Futteh Khan in one last charge against these Feringhee dogs. In that charge he will fall. Then go and make your own terms with Shah Soojah.' The high-souled appeal inspired no worthy response, but one is loath to credit the testimony of the soldier of fortune Harlan that his guards forsook the Dost, and that the rabble of troops plundered his pavilion, snatched from under him the pillows of his divan, seized his prayer carpet, and finally hacked into pieces the tent and its appurtenances. On the evening of August 2nd, the hapless man shook the dust of the camp of traitors from his feet and rode away toward Bamian, his son Akbar Khan, with a handful of resolute men, covering the retreat of his father and his family. Tidings of the flight of Dost Mahomed reached Keane on the 3rd at Sheikhabad, where he had halted to concentrate, and Outram volunteered to head a pursuing party, to consist of some British officers as volunteers, some cavalry, and some Afghan horse. Hadji Khan Kakur, the earliest traitor of his race, undertook to act as guide. The man's devices of delay defeated Outram's fierce energy, perhaps in deceit, perhaps because he regarded it as lacking discretion, for Akbar Khan made a long halt on the crown of the pass, waiting to check any endeavour to press closely on his fugitive father, and it would have gone hard with Outram, with a few fagged horsemen at his back, if Hadji Khan had allowed him to overtake the resolute young Afghan chief. As Keane moved forward, there fell to him the guns which the Dost had left in the Urgundeh position. On August 6th he encamped close to Cabul, and on the following day Shah Soojah made his public entry into the capital, which he had last seen 30 years previously. After so many years of vicissitude, adventure and intrigue, he was again on the throne of his ancestors, but placed there by the bayonets of the government whose creature he was, an insult to the nation whom he had the insolence to call his people. The entry, nevertheless, was a goodly spectacle enough. Shah Soojah, dazzling in coronet, jewelled girdle and bracelets, but with no Koh-i-Noor now glittering on his forehead, bestrode a white charger whose equipments gleamed with gold. By his side rode Macnaghten and Burnes. In the pageant were the principal officers of the British army. Sabres flashed in front of the procession, bayonets sparkled in its rear as it wended its way through the great bazaar, which Pollock was to destroy 3 years later, and along the tortuous street to the gate of the Bala Hissar. But neither the monarch nor his pageant kindled enthusiasm in the Kabulese. There was no voice of welcome. The citizens did not care to trouble themselves so much as to make him a salaam, and they stared at the European strangers harder than at his restored majesty. There was a touch of pathos in the burst of eagerness to which the old man gave way as he reached the palace, ran through the gardens, visited the apartments, and commented on the neglect everywhere apparent. Shah Soojah was rather a poor creature, but he was by no means altogether destitute of good points, and far worse men than he were actors in the strange historical episode of which he was the figurehead. He was humane for an Afghan. He never was proved to have been untrue to us. He must have had some courage of a kind, else he would never have remained in Cabul when our people left it, in the all but full assurance of the fate which presently overtook him as a matter of course. Havelock thus portrays him, quote, a stout person of the middle height, his chin covered with a long, thick and neatly trimmed beard, dyed black to conceal the encroachments of time. His manner towards the English is gentle, calm and dignified, without haughtiness, but his own subjects have invariably complained of his reception of them as cold and repulsive, even to rudeness. His complexion is darker than that of the generality of Afghans, and his features, if not decidedly handsome, are not the reverse of pleasing. But the expression of his countenance would betray to a skilful physiognomist that mixture of timidity and duplicity so often observable in the character of the higher order of men in Southern Asia.' Chapter 3